I've learned, and it's been emphasized through other collaborators and watching the work of other close friends and collaborators who I have much respect for, is that it's about love and service, being a servant, right? Servant to others, servant to the project, and just pouring love into something. I think that's ultimately what this whole thing is about. But at the end of the day, I think it's important for me to remember, like, okay, I'm serving them, I'm serving the project. I want to leave the impression that I want to work with that person again. They really, you can feel the love that they poured into this, and they were a true servant.
Welcome to the Styleframe Saturdays podcast, the podcast dedicated to ideation, visual storytelling, and concept development as it pertains to an animated production. We'll be breaking down the brief of our guests' favorite style frames, and we'll also get a glimpse into the inspiration and workflows behind their frame of choice as well. That was Jay Morales, a filmmaker and photographer from Massachusetts. He thrives in telling stories that inspire hope and foster a sense of human connection, and his favorite frame that he's sharing with us today does just that. So, let's check it out. Hey Jay, thanks for joining me on the show today. How's everything going?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on. Having worked with you in the past, been a colleague of yours in the past, since the day I met you, been such a big fan of your work, continue to be a big fan of your work. I'm just so excited to have you on because, we haven't had too many, sort of like pure video people, filmmakers, photographers, cinematographers. And I think the lens through which you guys sort of, approach storytelling and tell stories is very unique. And, I'm just excited to have you on today to talk a bit about that. But to kind of jump right in, for those in our audience who may be unfamiliar with your work, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into video, filmmaking, photography, the works?
Yeah. So I grew up, didn't really have a lot of exposure to the arts until my sophomore year in college. So my sophomore year at college, junior college, a friend of mine who was in the video production program said, "Hey, I need somebody. I'm hosting a show. I'm producing a show. I need some talent on the show to help me out." So I go in there and I'm looking around at the studio and the behind the scenes of everything, and I'm like, "Wait a minute, this is a thing? How come I never knew about this?" You know what I mean? And I was on the path of being a coach and a teacher. That was my path. I was like, all right, my dream was to go play in the NFL. And if that doesn't work out, I'll coach and teach somewhere or something, And when I got exposed to that, it just really stirred something in me. And I was just like, I gotta figure out more about this. This is really exciting, So I started to inquire about it and ask questions about it. And then when I transferred to Southern Connecticut, they had a big communication program. And a lot of my peers ended up going to like ESPN. That was a common path. But when I got there, I had to double major as an education major. So I decided my second major would be communication, video production. And I just kept going further and further in that direction. I was just like, I could get out of school sooner, save some money, right? And do something I'm really passionate about if I continue in this path. So I dropped my education major and continued to pursue video production. And I mean, it's been a lot of ups and downs and weaving from that point. From Southern, I moved to New York with no reel and really not knowing how to get into this industry. But I just literally pounded the pavement, looked for jobs, and got a start at New York One News, where I started, I took a position as a media editor. I thought it was an editing position, but it ended up being just the ingest department. But it got me in there, and from there, made connections and got further into the editing process, and then really fell in love with storytelling after meeting some really amazing people and getting exposed to that. And the rest is history.
The rest is history. Well, I don't think I realized, before you were at New York One that were you in New York or were you in Connecticut, Massachusetts? I don't think I realized that, like you made the move to New York with New York One.
Yeah. So I grew up in Massachusetts, went to school at Southern in Connecticut, and then followed my now wife to New York City, where she was studying
Oh,
for a
okay.
fashion merchandising degree.
Okay.
And yeah, joined her, and yeah, just my reel consisted of a project that I did in college. It wasn't really much, so it was kind of one of those things where I'm sure you've heard, right? You can't get jobs that you haven't done before, right? So nobody's willing to give you the opportunity unless you prove you've done it before, right? So it was tricky. So just getting in was however I can get in, right? That was through the news industry, which is a whole
Absolutely.
different path, different experience.
Oh, for sure. And you're not the first to kind of, talk about your path, kind of getting into the industry, happening in that way too. I think, for people who, especially those who, kind of stumble upon like, oh, I really want to do filmmaking or animation or design or whatever. There's kind of this, journey to get to, like actually eventually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You take kind of some oddball jobs here and there to kind of get your feet wet and get into the industry and kind of learn the ropes and everything. So it's a very common story, and it's interesting to hear that that's how you kind of fell into filmmaking and cinematography and everything as well. Yeah, so I don't think I knew that part. I worked with
Yeah.
you however many years ago. I never knew that story. So
Actually, at the
good to know
time
now.
when we met, we were working at the was GBTV at the time. I think it was called, right?
Yes.
But
Yeah.
just before that, I was like working at after New York One. Mike Latchman got me a job at Fox Business when they had launched. They were looking for editors, so I got into
Okay.
there. Yeah, and then that's where I met a good friend Ron Brody, who's an incredibly talented director, creative director, and he kind of getting to know him really introduced me to other avenues of filmmaking and photography. His brother is an incredible photographer. He's an incredible filmmaker, and it just kind of exposed me to things in that aspect, and got again really excited about the potential of working in the industry, in that side of the industry, versus the live production kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the work that you're doing now is, slightly different. It's, what you're doing more so documentary type stuff.
Yeah. Yep. More
Okay, very
more
cool.
real life stories. Yeah. Where I feel like that part is has a little more legs now with against AI, right? I think people need still real stories, right? That can impact change, and I don't know. I love that part of it, just connecting with people and hearing people's stories and sharing people's stories.
Oh, for sure. Well, and I think that is part of the reason why we kind of get into these creative fields too. I think we get inspired by other people's stories and we want to tell those
Mm-hmm.
stories
Mm-hmm.
and share them with others. And I think that that's sort of the beauty of, you know, filmmaking, design, illustration, animation, just all of these sort of creative mediums is that they're just ways to tell stories. And I think stories, I mean, they've been important for probably millennia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's true.
So typically on the podcast, we talk about our guests' sort of favorite style frame, which is a design frame from the pre-production phase of an animation or motion design or illustrative or pure design project. And this phase is where the overall visual style and aesthetic starts to take shape. But so today we're going to apply that same concept to our discussion. Of course, centered around the early stages of filmmaking, cinematography, and video production. So, having said that, and knowing your background a little bit more, I'd love to talk about the project that you're sharing with us today and your, favorite production frame, as we'll call it. So, could you tell us a little bit about it?
So the one I shared with you is this image of that comes from Ben's story. It's an image where he's lying on the ground in a red hooded sweatshirt. That's kind of bringing the audience into his experience when he was shot as a teenager. Part of his life experience before giving his life to Christ. So the story was produced for the church that I was working for at the time, um, in order to show people's life change and experiences. We were trying to raise funds to give funds to certain people in the community So the church was coming together to raise funds to give to certain organizations that were making an impact in the community outside of the church. And one way to show people the impact that the church has was to show examples of people who have had experienced life change through that specific church. And Ben was a great example of someone who, he was kidnapped as a kid. He had a very tough upbringing and some really tough experiences. And it was really cool to see how his life transformed and the peace that he discovered after giving his life to Christ. Yeah, despite those experiences, in his early childhood.
Yeah, getting back to the frame that you shared with us from this Project Ben story. Before we hopped on today, I watched this piece again, and I know I watched it when you first sort of shared it, several years ago now, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago. And back then, it was a story that resonated with me. And it's a story that resonates with me today, again, because of what you were saying about, the types of stories that you like to tell, these sort of inspiring, sort of human centered stories, humanizing the experiences that we all have throughout life. And yeah, it's just, if you haven't seen this piece, I encourage everybody to go watch it. It's an incredible story about, this guy's, upbringing and how he found, Christ through the church, and that you were working for at the time and everything. And it's a beautiful just story about hope, I think. But I don't want to dive into too many details without you sort of telling us, what led you to sort of like building out Ben's story and everything. But yeah, if you could walk me through, like, sort of like the early stages of this project, like if you had a creative brief, like what did that look like? What were the goals and messaging for the project?
So yeah, the goal was to really show the church life transformation. The impact that the church is making. I think it's important. People want to know where their money's going, right? If they're going to invest in something, they want to know where their money's going, right? And I think money in the church can be a very sensitive thing, right? So I think it's important to show, like, we're not just asking you for your money. Like, here's an example of someone who has experienced life change and who's thriving, right? Based partly by the experience he's having here, or ultimately from God through the church, right? And it was important to share his story as an example. But I just want to go back real quick, wanted to share the reason why I chose this frame specifically, from the creative aspect. I think at this point, I mean, there's still a lot I don't know. There's still things I don't know that I don't know. You know what I mean? But at this point, I remember feeling like I want to bring a like professional, commercial quality, right, to a real life story, and suspend disbelief, right, which is what we want to do as filmmakers and storytellers, to really draw the audience into this person's experience. And how do you do that, right? Like I was like, how can I do that? And with this particular frame, I think it was being able to build the trust. Like, I think, to me, when I'm blown away by something, I'm like, man, how did they do that? How did they accomplish that? How did they get this person to do that? Like, how did they capture this moment so authentically and just really like draw you in? How did they execute that? And with this, it was about building trust with Ben, to the degree that I could get him in the middle of the road, laying down, right, to really bring that experience home. That shot in the film sits for a little while. I want the viewer to feel that impact. And as he's laying on the ground, the camera's pulling away, the ball is rolling away. Like, that whole moment right there was huge from like a production standpoint, but also from a storytelling standpoint. To be able to build the trust with him, that he would um, believe that, trust me with the care of telling his story, right? But also, like, getting him to understand the objective of what we were trying to do, right? It was December, it was cold, he's only in a sweatshirt, you know what I mean? So just all of that, coming together, it just it was kind of a moment like, wow, I could do this. Like I could, I'm doing this. You know what I mean? Like I could do this. It was kind of like a moment of like believing in myself at that time of like what I could do, you know, because I didn't come up in the traditional filmmaking way that many of my friends did, where they went to film school, you know. So a lot of my stuff was self-taught, you know, learning through experiences, and through collaborators, right? But I think it was true then, and I think I've learned, and it's been emphasized through other collaborators and watching the work of other close friends and collaborators who I have much respect for, is that it's about love and service, right? Service to being a servant, right? Servant to others, servant to the project, you know, and just pouring love into something. I think that's ultimately what this whole thing is about, you know, especially as an editor. As an editor, you're serving the director, you're serving the producer, you're serving the project, you know. So it can be challenging sometimes, you know, when you get notes that you're like, oh my goodness, I don't understand. This is not very clear. You're not being very articulate, and having that tension of going back and forth with communication, and everyone's different communication styles. But at the end of the day, I think it's important for me to remember, like, okay, I'm serving them, I'm serving the project. I want to leave the impression that I want to work with that person again. They really, you can
Mhm.
feel the love that they poured into this, and they were a true servant. So the same with, you know, Ben, you know, being able to serve him and his story, and to serve this project, pour love into it and build a trust and a connection with him, was I think what resulted into that frame.
Oh, for sure. I love how you sort of like contextualized everything just now, by the way. And I think like the love and the serving and trust, you know, I feel like that's sort of like a, if I could call it, you know, like sort of like a trifecta of like, you know, like the story, you know,
Mm,
it was just so beautifully said. Excuse me, how you said that. And I think, you know, the love and the serving, you know, what bridges that is that trust that you said that you're sort of building.
mm.
And it's just, that was just so beautifully said. So, yeah, I'm going to clip that up somewhere and remind myself of that from time to time, because it's true as a storyteller, you know, that those are the purposes behind it. And behind Ben's story, you know, you were talking about, you know, building this relationship with him, serving him, pouring love and passion into this project, building trust with him. You know, yeah, so spot on about what it means to be a storyteller, and then obviously, you know, applying that to this project. You know, I totally skipped over, probably one of the most important parts of our discussion too. You know, like we're talking about Ben's story as if like, you know, the audience knows what his story is, but you know, let's even just backtrack for a second there too. Like, could you just like give us like sort of an overview of like what his story is that you sort of that you were telling in this piece?
So, well, I should have rewatched it before to get really specific and clear. But the way I remember it is, he grew up in Haiti, and his father was a how do I put this? I can't remember if he was exactly a political figure, but wealthy in their community. And so it's not uncommon. It wasn't uncommon then. I don't know if it, you know, it's probably just as common now, but uh, kidnapping, you know, someone as a ransom, you know, wasn't uncommon, and Ben was a victim of that as a kid. I believe he was 9 years old when he was on his way to school and he got kidnapped, and held for ransom, you know, for his family. And so that's kind of depicted in the story, in his isolation and his experience, through that. And he was bound and his eyes were covered, for a period of time, and that led to some color blindness for him. So the color in the story, you know, in the transition of that color being muted, or, you know, desaturated, is kind of the depiction of that. And that's one part of his story. The other part was, you know, they ended up moving to Florida, and, you know, on his way home from school, or the basketball court, I forget, he was shot with some gunfire, not directed at him, you know, but it was crossfire, and he happened to, get shot in the process. So that's depicted in his story, and that's what leads to that frame that we're talking about today. Uh, and so he had those experiences that kind of gives you a little bit of a background of his life experience,
Hmm.
and then I think his family, he came from a family of believers as well, but somewhere along the line he wasn't following Christ, and then he found this church, and it really brought him back to Christ. I think he met a girl who was going to this church, and I don't think that's really depicted in the story, but he ended up coming to the church and serving in the church, and just really experiencing some life change through his experience at the church, and just growing in his spiritual life. And I think he's saw the fruit of that in other aspects of his life. So yeah, that's I think what I love about Ben's story is it's an example of how I think some people are like, they question God, like, why do bad things happen to good people, kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I think nobody can really deny the power of the Holy Spirit. When the Holy Spirit transforms someone, it's just, there's just nothing like that. There's no denying that. Just regardless of their previous life experiences, it's just really cool to see um, people's lives transformed, and especially with everything that's happening in today's world. It's always good to see people experiencing life to the fullest. You know.
Oh, for sure, for sure, and that sense of hope. I think that for me, at least, that's what really resonates with me about this piece. Again, having watching it when you first sort of shared it several years ago, and then rewatching it again before we were chatting today. That's, and I don't know if that was the intentional message or not, but for me, that's what kind of came out to me, is that like, yeah, hope in that, and faith in that, things will work out. You're gonna get, stuff's gonna happen in life,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
even maybe sometimes even some really bad stuff, like like in Ben's story.
Right.
But if you keep that faith and hope, like there is that opportunity for things to sort of turn around, if you believe, you know
Yeah.
and I'm sure our audience is full of believers, non-believers, maybe believers of other faiths too.
Mm-hmm.
um but that human sense of hope, I think, is
Yeah.
something that we can all connect to with Ben's story, for sure.
Right. Right. No, that's good. That's a great point.
So when you look at the credits of this piece, you talk about how you were the producer, the director, and even the editor on it. you know when it came time to sort of build out the concept for this story, for Ben's story, like, what did that look like? Where did you start? Did you start with like a visual script, or some just like basic references, or like a visual script? Like, walk me through a little bit about those, like, sort of early stages of building out this story and concept.
I think before then it was like, okay, let me find a good example of something like this that's been done, that I can like uh kind of uh deconstruct and arrive at that. You know what I mean? Something similar to
Yeah.
that.
Hmm.
Um and so I mean, for a long time that's what I would do. I was in the learning process, just kind of seeing things and trying to deconstruct them, and like, I really love that about this. How can I make something like that? But I think this was a project where I was like, I I need to get to know him. What is his story, and then how can we tell it? So I think I shared a doc with you about the pre-production, and it starts with a link to his Instagram. Just let me learn more about Ben, and that's kind of when it was decided like that would be a good story to share. I was like, let me learn a little bit about him. So I checked out his Instagram, and then I started to connect with him. I met at his apartment. We hung out for a little bit. We checked out some areas, location scouting in his area. He was living in Worcester at the time, so we were in his apartment. That's where I took some production stills, some pre-production stills, and just spent some time with him, getting to know him, getting to learn his story a little bit. And then it was like, okay, well, these are the points of his story that I think would be impactful to share. And from there, it was like, all right, how do we execute this, right? So at the time, I had met thankful for Vimeo and Instagram, where we can connect with other creatives and other filmmakers. At the time, I didn't have a lot of people in the church who were into filmmaking in this way, right? So I started to connect outside of the church with other filmmakers and creatives, and this was a good project to bring someone on. And like, okay, at the time it was Wesley and Brendan who DP'd this for me, and I had met them through Vimeo, and
Oh wow.
and yeah, I met them through Vimeo, and they're incredibly talented dudes. And Wesley had this like he's very technical and loved like how to make like the cleanest image and lighting and everything else. And Brandon was a very like you can feel the heart in his craft. You can feel the love, right, in his craft, in the way he told stories, just very thoughtfully crafted. Um, and so I just wanted to work with those guys, and I knew that if I had somebody who I could trust on the image making side of things, I could focus on the story side of things, and you know, and just kind of distribute the weight, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, this thing is all about the connections and networking and collaborating with people. So to try to bring my best, I knew that I needed other people, right? So I brought a producer on from the church to help focus on this area, on the area of like keeping us on time and things like that. Those guys were responsible for the image making, right? And then my friend Raf was huge in like grip and making sure he could help reposition lights and things like that. And then another friend helped provide the studio where we shot some of the stuff. And so all together, I don't think I'm forgetting anybody, but all together, it took all of us to put this together. Um, but a lot of it was done in the preparation, right? Getting to know Ben, and like we didn't have a whole lot of time, not a big budget project, right? So a lot of I think everybody involved was just giving their time. So I wanted to be as efficient as possible and shoot in as few days as possible, but still bring his story to life. I
Mm-hmm.
think we only had 2 shoot days. One was the interview day, and one was 2 or 3 shoot days.
Oh
I
wow.
think we did all of the studio stuff, and his interview was one day, and I think all the studio stuff was one day, and all the exteriors were one day. I think, or the exteriors and the studio stuff were the same day, and the interview was the other day. Anyway, it was without a budget in this case, we had to try to be as resourceful as possible, and days equal money and time. So thankful to everyone who was involved and gave their time. Could not have done it without them. To this degree, I'm really happy with the outcome of the story technically and everything else. So yeah, getting everyone together and getting organized, right, to try to help everybody understand the vision and our goal and how to get on the same page. I shared with you the shot list, and like I poured a lot of time and energy into this shot list, but then it got like overwhelming at times. I didn't have the greatest sense of how long something would take, how long it would take to light this studio, to get the lighting, execute the lighting the way we wanted to execute it. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we ended up like getting rid of the shot list for the way I had it all organized. Cause I think at one point I was like, all right, we need, this lighting setup for these shots. And then I think we got out of that lighting setup too early, and so it kind of just threw us all up. It was a great learning experience for that. But it's also like you go in with a plan. I think what I've learned with this is like you go in with a plan, but you have to be open to pivoting and adjusting as things unfold, right?
Yeah.
Especially that can be the challenging part of the collaborative, is other people might bring in other ideas, and it's like
Right.
with a plan and with a vision up front, you can say, I don't think that's right for this, or yeah, I didn't think of that. Let's definitely try that. But then there's you have to consider time, and then you have to consider, if we spend time on this, are we still going to have enough time to get everything else that we need? So it's tricky. It was really learning how to manage the time. Oh, sorry about that. Learning how to manage the time, but being flexible. Being flexible that this is the plan, but it's not quite working out like that. Let's pivot. Let's adjust. Do we have enough at this point to capture this part of the story? It's really important to move on. In this case, I think we were using natural light, so it was like we had to cut out of the studio so we can get out. Yeah, I do remember now. It was the same day, so we had to cut out of the studio so we can get in the winter. The sun sets earlier. We needed to be on the street for that sequence at a certain time. Ended up working out because it ended up being closer to blue hour, and which is not an hour. you know but it gave us the enough light for the exposure that we needed to execute that shot that we're referencing in the style frame.
Yeah.
uh,
No, I'm happy you touched on the whole shot list aspect of this, and sort of, I guess, the responsibilities that come with sort of being a director and like a producer on a project like this, because it's something that I've always wondered just myself too. Obviously, because I'm not a filmmaker or a cinematographer or editor, but when you're working with live film shoots, and then obviously working to then sort of like refine the story and post and everything, like how do you, as a director, someone who's on set overseeing all of this, and like you said, being flexible with like other ideas that might come to the table in real time, how do you maintain the cohesiveness of the story when you've got like multiple film days and some other ideas that get floated around? Like how did you approach that for this project?
trust trust and surrender.
Oh, I love
trust
that.
trust and surrender, right? Because like I said, I had a game plan. Like I had a shot list. It was like timed out. It was I color coordinated to shots that were on dolly or on handheld, or what the lighting setup would be. Like I had it as mapped out as I possibly could. But what I didn't have the greatest understanding of how long something would take. I still struggle with that, right? Like even when it comes to like daily things, I'm like, oh, I think I can mulch this area outside in my lawn in like an hour, and here we are half a day later, right? You know what I mean? Like it's I'm that's one thing. I'm like super ambitious. Like even this project was super ambitious, right? Like I think I always try to challenge myself to do something to the best it can be every time, right? And try to push as hard as I can and try to maximize everything, and beyond maximize, like just try to push. So sometimes time or more, I mean, energy runs out. I mean,
Hmm.
because the time is the time, but how much energy do you have to push, you know what I mean? Versus, again, it came to trusting and surrendering. All right, I did the best that I could do, and I think we got, according to my shot list, we checked some things off, and I think that we got some areas right according to the script and the because we shot his interview first so that I could help. I think I might have even cut his interview before we went and shoot the B-roll so that I can know how much time we needed to cover each part of his story. So that was incredibly helpful. You don't always have that luxury, but if you do, to be able to shoot the interview first and capture the person's story, how they tell the story, how much time they spend in one part of their story, and how much of it you want to include in the edit. And all right, how much coverage does that need B-roll wise? All right, so these are the shots that I think we need, and these shots need to be approximately this long, etc. So
Right.
the shot list was helpful for that.
Oh,
But
very cool.
managing all that,
It's
just
a lot.
trust. Yeah,
Yeah.
you trust and you surrender. Like I did the best I could, and I trust that we did. And in this case, I didn't like. I feel like it fell short towards the end. Like I feel like you have this amazing, maybe like first three quarters, and then like visually and production wise and production quality, it kind of falls off with some of the um, uh, stuff in the church, like in the hallway, and where it's overhead lighting, and it feels kind of like a different project. It feels more like a, a news, right, documentary, where you're just, it, um, interiors with overhead lights. You're not controlling the light or anything else, but it was real. It was in the moment. It was him huddling up with his team, before going out and serving the church, and things like that. So it fit in that sense by being true to his story, but not in the way the rest of the piece was produced. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's funny you're bringing that up because to me at least, watching it as like as the viewer, the audience, I thought that was actually like kind of intentional because, you've got this very dark, sort of color palette and like mood and lighting, which I would love to talk to you about as well in a second. But you've got this sort of darker tones at the very beginning of the story, and as you move into like Ben, finding the church, trusting his faith in God and everything. I thought that those lighting decisions were intentional in that, like, like here's his hero moment, like finding his, faith family and the church and everything. And I thought that like sort of like difference in lighting and like, literally like the light, dark and light contrast. I thought that was so intentional. So the fact that you're sort of like, well, we're just staying true to his story, we're following him there. It's kind of funny that it like coincidentally really worked out in terms of like sort of a visual narrative.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the right that you trust and surrender and hand it over, right? Because like to me, I felt like it felt like disconnected, like from the quality perspective, right? But it's
Okay.
still true to his story, you know. So you surrender that. Okay, like maybe there's a better, more high quality production way of sharing this aspect of his story. Maybe another approach could have been to not stage those moments, but like maybe relocate them into a part of the church that had better looking background, better lighting, better available light. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
But then you're getting away from reality, I guess. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it was kind of a wrestle in that sense, to surrender the quality, matching the quality from the beginning to the end. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Hmm.
Technically speaking, lighting wise and color and production value and everything else.
Right, right. And I think as creatives too, we tend to like nitpick our own stuff too, and we're like, oh, we could have done this a little bit better. But I mean, the piece is beautiful. Again, it's like it's definitely a favorite of mine of yours that I love watching it. And the story is just obviously very impactful as well. But yeah, like the lighting. I'm so happy that we're talking about the lighting too, because that's something that I'd love to like dive into a little bit further with you. Is that obviously I'm assuming the story informed a lot of your lighting decisions, but when it came to lighting, like what was some of the inspiration behind it? Like what elements of Ben's story like really made you hone in on like, like, oh yeah, we're going to do sort of this sort of darker, cooler tone in the beginning and, have it end up where it did in the end.
So yeah, the color thing really stemmed from his color blindness, right? So like
Oh, right.
that whole experience, right? And the blue was kind of like a heavenly but also like a cold experience for him, right? So I think at the time there was this project called the Bale Project who did an incredible job of filmmaking and telling that story. And when I remember seeing that around the time, and it kind of reminded me of also like the movie Belly, Hype Williams' first like directorial debut.
Hmm.
And kind of those influences. So like from a creative and art standpoint, that there was some influences there, but I think really the part of his story where he became colorblind. So how do we bring the audience into that experience? And so at one point we pull that color out when he starts to talk about how he became colorblind, right? So we have this whole blue set. It's cold. It's him in isolation. It's his kidnapping experience, and then we pull the color out of that when he talks about um, experiencing color blindness, and then the exteriors using natural daylight, the winter cold again that cold feeling. I thought it fit perfectly. Like for that, like we're initially my mind is like, oh man, like should can we find a place that kind of feels like Florida that kind of bring the viewer into like when he lived in Florida? And like, no, we can't. We don't have the budget for that. We're not, going down there. But the reality is he lives here, and to draw the viewer into his experience in the daylight exteriors on the street, I thought it was important to have him wearing a red sweatshirt to indicate being shot. You know what I mean? Because we weren't gonna reenact. It wasn't like a reenactment, but I wanted to
Right.
kind of bring the audience there. So that was not necessarily a lighting choice, but what do you call it? Not stage design, but production design choice, right? Again, I try to be as thoughtful about every aspect of it as possible, even in the editing. At one point, I think Brandon actually colored this. He color graded this story, but at the end, I was kind of going back about whether or not we go from cold to warm. We ended up going from cold to warm in his interview. Towards the
Oh,
end, it
that's right.
ends up being warm. And I was kind of like, is that too cheesy? You know what I mean? Is it too literal? Is it too cheesy? There's always that balance. You never know how it's going to be received. Is it going to totally pull the viewer out? Some people will never even catch that. You know what I mean? So there's that balance of like, who's my audience? Like, am I trying to please other creatives and other filmmakers here, or am I trying to really tell his story and draw the viewer in? And ultimately, the right thing to do is focus on the audience and the viewer. And you could argue, from a creative standpoint, like it's a little much. It's a little, maybe it's making it too much about me and the creative process than it is his story. So there's that tension to manage, I think. But yeah, ultimately, we ended up with the decision of going to warm, from cool to warm, as a warm expression of where he is now, versus the cold days, those isolated, dark experiences of his previous life versus, BC to now, walking in his faith.
Right, right. I don't even think I realized in the interview section it goes from cool to warm as well. Like I saw the cool sort of like backstory from cool to warm, but I didn't notice it with the interview. So it's funny that you point that out. Yeah, again, whether that was intentional or not, like that just it kind of just it flows. And I love that you're bringing up sort of like well, who is the audience for this piece, like because that really drives creative decisions too, and it sounds like that's what happened with you on this project as well. It's so important to kind of ground ourselves in that, because I think we can get lost in the creative process just for our own fulfillment, like I want to like
Mm-hmm.
add in a little bit of flair here, or try to incorporate this sort of you know skill, or what have
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if it's not going to serve the audience in the end, you know who's going to appreciate it, other than
Right.
ourselves.
Right. Yeah, and it's tricky because you want to insert a little bit of yourself in some of these
Yes,
things. So you have to be careful with that, I think,
absolutely.
but because it's kind of like your conversation with Matt, right? I think a lot of our creativity is influenced by our life, and our
Hmm.
life experiences. So balancing how much of that you incorporate versus serving the project and not serving yourself. You know what I mean?
For sure, for sure. Well, I love that you're sort of talking about sort of the audience in conjunction with Ben's story and everything, in terms of how you sort of approach the filming and editing aspects of this project. But there's obviously a sound component to this whole thing too. Just briefly, could you talk me through like what informed some of your sound design decisions for this? Because you handled the sound and music and stuff on this, right?
Yes. Yep. I did all
Okay.
that. Yep.
Yeah, walk
Yep.
walk me through a little bit of that too, because sound is equally important to the visual, if not maybe more important than the visual sometimes, to really sort of bring out that full story.
I would argue for sure more important, especially when telling stories, right? Anybody, especially these days, right? We're
Hmm.
taking hundreds of $1,000s of production equipment, right? In many cases, right? Or even on a low budget scale, right? We're taking 4K, 6K, 8K images and adding film grain to it and making it feel nostalgic, right? And I
Hmm.
feel like that's a thing, right? So people will accept grainy images and lens flares and messiness and motion blur and everything, but they're not as easy to accept poor quality, right? I was watching a documentary on Amazon recently, and I couldn't get through the first 10 minutes because the audio was so bad. Like I couldn't understand. It was a documentary, and I think it was on there because of who the person was, and it's interesting to learn about that person and get a behind the scenes look at that person. But the production quality was not very good, and really the sound quality wasn't good. So it's important to capture when you're telling a story. I think that I call it the talking head, right? The person, the subject speaking to the camera or on screen, hearing their audio is incredibly important, right? That they are the heart of the story, right? So having crisp, clean audio is super important. Getting it is not always easy, right? And I mean, I didn't always do a good job of that early on, even though I did understand the importance of it. I didn't always. I think it was one of those things where it was like, I gotta make this look as good as possible. Oh yeah, and then I got to get the audio in there. You know what I mean? So I mean, it stemmed, I think, just from being a one man band early on, just doing everything myself. You know what I mean? But I mean, anytime you're able to bring in an audio professional, by all means, to focus just like you would for the lighting, have somebody focus on the audio. You know, it's super important. Have somebody with headsets on, listening, making sure, and not being afraid to say, "Oh, hold on, can we go back to that again?" You know, so
Right.
that we can make sure that that audio is not too it is clear for the audience to hear. So audio incredibly important. Music incredibly important because I mean it sets the tone. You know, it sets the tone of the story. I feel like oftentimes I look for the right music. I mean, finding the right music is super important. Music really drives a lot of my editing to really bring the audience into what I want them to feel in this part of the story or throughout this story. So the music, the subject's voice, incredibly important, and then sound design. I added some sound design elements of when he's before our style frame here. You know, he was shot, right? So we're following him from behind. He's holding the basketball. We hear the gunshot, and he drops the ball, and then we cut to this wide reverse of him, you know, laying on the ground, and we're pulling away. So how do you bring the viewer into that experience? Sound played a huge role into that. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Can you imagine that sequence without the gunshot? You know,
I know. Yeah.
I don't think it quite hits home the same
No,
way.
definitely doesn't. And it's, I'm looking at the shot list that you shared, for this project too, at the moment. And there is a column for sound, but, it's hard for me to decipher because obviously I'm not a, filmmaker like you. But, when you're sort of even planning out this project and, obviously you have to know that there's going to be sound injected at some point other than just sort of the talking head, like you said, you know, when you think about sound and sound design and the music and everything, are you hearing certain things as you're building out this concept early on? Like, are you hearing certain things like, oh, I know I need to have that, or I know that the mood of the music has to sound something like this. Like, when you're so early on in the creative process, like how much is sound influencing those decisions?
I feel like now more than even at the time of this project, now so much more. You know, now I start to get an idea or I get approached with a project. I'm like, all right, what does that sound like? You know, I was on a shoot recently with a friend and I was cam opping for him. And as we're setting up the interview and we're thinking about we're shooting B-roll next with the subject, what does this story sound like? You know, because that really influences, you know, if we have a tracking shot, how fast are we moving with the subject? Is this like a part of the story where we're like whipping through, you know, or are we just, you know, fly on the wall, just following this subject, or really trying to help the audience feel the emotions of this, you know? So how do we execute that? Is it through what's the pacing of that, right? And so understanding what it sounds like can kind of help guide, you know, how you're shooting, you know. Is this like a handheld whip, we're whipping from here to here, so we need high energy camera movement to, you know, be supported by high energy music, you know what I mean? So yeah, incredibly important. Yeah, I definitely think more about what does this sound like,
Yeah.
how is
And
this
I
going to
think,
make people feel? Yeah.
yeah, no, for sure. No, sorry to interrupt you for a second there, but I love that you said the word pacing too. I think that that's probably a commonality and through line between sort of like traditional filmmaking and visual storytelling through to other mediums like, animation, motion design, even illustration and design, because you can sort of like you can feel that sort of tension and pacing and movement in some of these more stiller mediums too. And I think that that's just sort of a great word to highlight that can be used throughout all these different mediums and projects. Because I'm sure, obviously, not just the pacing of the sound, but pacing of like how the sequence of shots are going to come together, wide, close up, color. Yeah, I love that. I love that word. I think that that's it's definitely something that I'm going to embrace a little bit more going forward too. Pacing, I think, is a great way to sort of describe sort of that tension that you've been talking about all along in the story as well.
Yeah, Lucas Harger is a great editor. He's edited a lot of stuff for Ryan Booth, but he's done a couple things. I think Film Riot has interviewed him. I think Music Bed might have interviewed him as well. But he talks about the importance of tone, pace, and rhythm in editing. I think he articulates it much better than I could. But I think that it's super important. Yeah, super important having the right tone, pace, rhythm when it comes to editing. Incredibly important. Music helps with that. Sound helps with that, right? Having
Absolutely.
having little rips of swishes and whatever to help emphasize and augment the feeling of moving fast or whatever, But sound is incredibly important. I'm so grateful that there are so many more resources now available to us, that offer sound libraries. You know,
Yeah.
super helpful
Yeah.
whenever you can't get it in camera.
For sure, for sure. And I think Sean and I were talking about this a little bit on his episode, but visually, I think without the sound too, like you kind of lose some of the other sort of sensory experiences that
Mm,
complete the sort of full experience too, right?
yeah,
Like not saying that like what you hear is what you smell, but like there's something interesting about like if you think back on a memory or a story that you can vividly pull up, right? You remember the sounds, the visuals, what you were smelling, like even sort of like temperaturely, like hot or cold and
like
it's
in
just
Ben's
very.
story with the winter feel and the cold and the
Yes,
isolation and the blue lighting. Yeah, yep.
exactly. Feeling the warmth of the light and everything. I remember that, distinctively in his story too. Yeah. So it's very interesting that just yes, you could have like a visual story and it could be totally beautiful, but without these other sort of elements that then even kind of even pull on other sensories,
Mm,
it feels incomplete. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree more that like the sound like really completes, these sort of like video stories and everything.
yeah, 100%. Very important. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, this has been, I mean, my gosh, I feel like I could talk about Ben's story and talk with you for the longest time about
Same.
all of this stuff. I always feel like every time, even when we were working together and every time we sort of catch up, from now on, I feel like I learned so much from you about, the process of, filmmaking and cinematography and telling a really impactful, like visual story. So, thank you for bringing this project and this, style frame, production frame, whatever you want to call it today. I do have two last questions though about this
Yeah.
because I have to ask this of every guest that comes on the show. With regards to this project and this production frame, what would you say were the biggest challenges and rewards about pulling this whole project together?
Challenges, time and energy, right? Going back to, I wore many hats, and even bringing other people on and the amount of communication that entails. Scheduling time with Wes, who helped me, scout locations for this, and communicating the vision to everyone on set. So that there could be room for collaboration that will still be in line with the vision of the project. But also, like you said, making sure we have what we need, so not diverting too far. So time and energy was a challenge for sure. Just maintaining that energy from beginning to end. And I feel like the smaller the budget and the smaller the crew and the smaller the production, I think the more energy is required, to wear all these hats. I mean, actually, I say that, but at the same time, the more people you have to manage, the more energy is just spread in different directions, right?
Very
So,
true.
so yeah, time and energy definitely a challenge. Staying on schedule and everything else, and then allowing room for collaboration. But then also, uh, what was your other question? Sorry, challenges and
Biggest reward.
Biggest reward was being able to share his story and seeing the impact that it had on the church, and the people in the church, and it served the outcome. The outcome was that we were able to bless other people in the community, other organizations in the community that were helping people, in other aspects, of the community. So that was huge. Yeah, I don't remember exactly how much we were able to raise or give away exactly. I don't have those numbers, but I think we achieved the goal that we had set out to. So
Oh, that's amazing. Oh,
yeah,
so from sort of like that perspective, like yeah, it sounds like it was just like all around, just like a very successful project, which is great to hear.
yeah, and then Wesley and I have collaborated on other projects since then. He's kind of shifted his trajectory. Brandon moved away and focused more on editing. Raf and I still continue to collaborate. So relationships definitely grew and evolved from there. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot through that experience. Some things that I carry with me, and some things that I'm like, you know what, I don't need to invest my energy in that aspect of it. Let's focus more on this aspect of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, great learning experience.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, wonderful to hear all around too, from relationships to learning to just, like, the impact it had on the church and everything. That's awesome. Well, this might be a similar answer or the exact same answer. And I know that you kind of talked about it at the very beginning of this episode, but in addition to like the biggest rewards and challenges of this piece, what would you say, makes this frame your favorite frame?
Oh yeah, it goes back to the trust, the fact that I was able to get Ben to trust me to a degree that he could see the vision, right? That I could articulate to him, like, this is what we're trying to do, this is what I want the audience to feel, and then get him to understand that, and be okay with that, and being okay to lay on the cold ground in the winter, for a decent period of time, you know what I mean, to execute that shot. I think that it's existed in both my reels, because I love this frame so much because of that. I think really, uh, color came together. There's so much there, it's so rich for me. And but mostly it was that, like, okay, I can do this. I can take, uh I can gain the trust of real life people, right? And help them understand how we can suspend this belief to the audience to bring their story to life, right? The same way people do for high production, films, so that was my directing hat, I think, grew, you know um, in that through that experience.
Oh, for sure. Oh, I bet.
Yeah,
Yeah, no. And, I think the important point you're making too here is that, trust is key in all aspects of life.
yeah,
And
yep,
so, I obviously then it's pretty important when it comes to, storytelling too. So, yeah, I feel like that's been kind of the recurring theme throughout this discussion today is that, like there's trust on all different kinds of levels. And it made the piece successful as a result of it. So, that's great to hear.
yeah. I'm so glad to hear that it resonated with you. You never know, I don't know how many views. It doesn't have like crazy amounts of views, and I feel like sometimes people determine success based off of that, but I think it was
Yes.
successful for this purpose that it served.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, no, I'm not gonna lie. Like, I watched it several years ago when you first shared it, and when I rewatched it today, like, I'm gonna be completely honest. Like, when you see that sort of end part of his story where he's, overcomes just such adversity, it does bring a little bit of a tear to your eye. Like, I'm not gonna lie. And again, the whole hope aspect of the story is what really like kind of touches your heart. So at least for me, it did, and that's why I'm so happy that you shared this piece today because I think it is just it's a masterful example of what really impactful storytelling can do. And like you just said, it served its purpose and then some too, which is great to hear.
That's the greatest compliment I feel like I can be paid, is that you felt the emotion. You know what I mean?
Yes. But isn't that the point of storytelling? Like
Yeah,
you could,
yeah,
you can
yeah.
recount there's a reason why there's a difference between storytelling and just like spitting out data. And like you
Mm.
just said, we measure, things in algorithmically
Algorithms.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
In terms of likes and,
yeah.
views and this and that. And, does that play a role now? Yeah, I guess it does in this modern digital
Sure.
age, but you got to feel it.
Yeah, yeah, you got to feel it, definitely. Now to get the people to share it, right? That's the
Yes, that's
next,
true.
like,
Feel and then share in this
yeah,
day and age.
yep, yep. Because that's how
Well,
you expand that influence and you get that story to reach its maximum, potential.
oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm not, I'm definitely not going to downplay the fact that, like, sort of incentivizing people to kind of share these stories is not worthwhile. It absolutely is to, if you're trying to, sort of plant your flag or make a statement or, like get a point across or whatever, that is definitely important. But I definitely do feel like you need to feel it.
Oh,
It has to
100%.
move you to share it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yes, yes, 100%, for sure.
Well, I mean, this has been the biggest pleasure today, Jay. Thank you so
Likewise.
much for taking the time to chat, sharing this frame and this project with us. If people want to connect with you to learn more about what you're working on, what's the best way for them to do so?
I'm on Instagram, j.morales on Instagram. And then, yeah, that's basically, I don't, Vimeo.
Okay.
But those are the two platforms I mainly use. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, we'll be sure to share your information and links to some of the tools, resources, and references that we've mentioned here for our audience to check out. But that wraps it up for today, everyone. Feel free to email us at styleframesatpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what you think of the show. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, if you like what you see and hear here, please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and review the show on your favorite podcasting platforms as well. And lastly, come connect with us on social. We're on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again, Jay, for joining us today, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see you in the next one.